Hi, this is Jill Maurer, and welcome to Maurer Glass Podcast. Today I am here with Artimus, and we are discussing Charles Dickens' role in redesigning Christmas. Hi there. Well, we are doing this podcast today because Artimus is an avid Charles Dickens fan, and he often talks about Charles Dickens' role in redesigning Christmas. A lot of it, Charles Dickens redesigning Christmas, while he did write, I think, 3 books on Christmas, the real thing that affected the way Christmas was celebrated and how we changed it was A Christmas Carol. If you don't remember A Christmas Carol, it is the story of Ebenezer Scrooge and how he is not into Christmas. He's all bah humbug about Christmas, and he is visited by the ghost of his late business partner, Jacob Marley, and later by 3 ghosts: the ghost of Christmas past, the ghost of Christmas present, and the ghost of things yet to come, or something like that. This is really a wonderful story. It was most of Dickens' books were very long, and this is really a novella. It's a short. I don't know. It's not a short story, but it's a short book.
Yeah, it's a novella, and it's interesting because it's divided not by chapters, but it's divided by staves. It has 5 staves. Staves being those on sheet music, the bars where all the notes are. So he writes it in this weird way where it's sort of like it actually is a Christmas Carol sheet music, but it's a story. So
nice.
And it is very short, but I always thought that was cool that he called them staves instead of chapters.
So that's kind of where the name comes from. That's interesting. I didn't realize that. Because a lot of people who are familiar with the story actually don't realize that's the title sometimes.
Mm-hmm. And most of the time people see it, they're seeing like the modern day adaptation of it. Like they're seeing the Flintstones version, the Disney, any of the million versions of it that have come out. So yeah, it's interesting when you think about it as like it's this really short story that has been expanded to like full length films.
That's pretty cool. Even here in Raleigh, there's a rendition of it that there's the same man, Ira David Wood, who's been doing it for 40 years or something, and his adaptation has migrated and changed over the years. I mean, it's not a story that people feel that they have to stick completely with. I think it went into, he wrote it in, I think, 1843.
About that time, yeah.
And it's been in constant production ever since, and people have taken all kinds of liberties with it. But it is really a very charming story. This is also the story of Tiny Tim.
Mm-hmm. So what are your favorite part? What is it about it that you personally like?
I personally like this idea of the ghosts in general, of the, and sort of questioning whether was he really visited by ghosts, or was this a dream, and does it even matter? Mm-hmm. I think he says, you're not really here, you're a piece of potato or something that wasn't fully digested. And I like, that concept of, is it a spiritual story? Is it a secular story? Is it spiritual in that they're really ghosts? Is it just a dream? Is it, you can't really define it. It could be a true story because maybe it's a dream, but it's, I just like sort of the magic and wonder of it.
Yeah, and they don't really tell you, and they give you a little bit of hint that it maybe could go either way. One time I was talking to someone, and they had an interesting fan theory. This is one of my favorite. It was about how the entire thing was actually set up by the town. The town did this entire thing to him to sort of get him to change because he was such an awful person. Because this was back when, you don't have cars, so your community is your community. This is where you live. So the idea is that they put on makeup and they tried to scare him into being a nicer guy.
So that's sort of twisted.
It's a little bit, but sort of a little Inception-esque, but definitely interesting fan theory. You could just tell the guy, hey, could you lighten up? It's the holidays.
Right. That would definitely be a case for the ends justifying the means. The end justifying, yeah. Mm-hmm. So what is your favorite part of the story?
I like a lot of the dialogue. Dickens had this amazing ability to say something in a way that was not just interesting for the sake of being interesting, but the very structure of the sentence outweighed what you were saying. For instance, when Jacob Marley shows up, Scrooge is very scared of him, but as he keeps talking to him, he gets more open, and gets more bold. And it's not until, and in most adaptations they do it this way, it's not until Scrooge says, look, Jacob, I don't know what you're upset about. You were always a good man of business. And that's the point where Jacob snaps. He says, business. Like, mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. All of this stuff. My trade was a small drop in the ocean that is my business. And he finally snaps, and the way that he layers that dialogue, it just makes it more and more intense. So
interesting. And Dickens apparently wrote this book something like in December. He published it in December.
6 weeks. It took him 6 weeks to write it, which is really short for most novellas. I mean, that's a very fast turnaround time.
Yeah.
One of the best biographies that was written about him is by Michael Slater. And he basically, he has a lot of accounts of who he was. They have like the earliest things that the guy ever wrote. And what they were saying was he had like several hours worth of, he had to walk about 15 to 20 miles to different places and jobs. And he was like constantly writing stuff in his head before he sat down to write. So although it took him like 6 weeks to write Christmas Carol, he had sort of like mulled over the concept for like a long time.
Interesting, because my understanding, my recollection from my, grade school, high school education was that he became a rock star in his day. He's not one of these people who is later discovered as a writer. And that, he sometimes the books were actually released in chapters, and he wrote very prolifically. He didn't feel the need to distill dialogue, because the point was for it to be read around the fireplace. It was sort of that, this is certainly pre-television, probably pre-radio. This was the entertainment of the day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, most of the biographies say that by the time he wrote Christmas Carol, he was a successful writer. He was struggling financially to feed, I believe at the time he had 5 or 6 kids, but he was known as a very good writer. His initial goal with Christmas Carol was to write something that he could support his family, because like you were saying, he did publish things in series, and his publisher at the time wanted to pay him less for his last series because it wasn't selling that well. So he wanted to write something that could really like help his family. But as he got into the project, he started realizing what he was doing was way more important than that.
Yeah, and apparently it sold out just before Christmas. I mean, it came out in December, it still sold out before Christmas, and then did not serve his purpose for making money anyway, in that by January somebody had lifted it and was selling it. He had to take them to court and won, but whoever he took to court went bankrupt, and his profits were spent defending the story.
That's exactly what happened. The first edition, they only printed about 6,000 copies of it, which for even just London is not quite enough. So it sells out immediately. And he doesn't make that much money for a couple of reasons. Number one, he has a lot of really interesting design must-haves for the book. It has to have that gold leaf edge pages. It has to be wrapped in a red felt. It was a very good, and they went to like 2 or 3 runs of it before he was like, okay, that's how it should look. And the price it was sold for at the time would be the modern day equivalent of about $30, which is pretty expensive for, first of all, a novella, and second of all, for middle of the 19th century London. It's a bit pricey, but it sold out. But the high cost of making that particular style of it, and the ones that you mentioned, the ones who knocked it off, made like a 2 pence, like a very small, cheap version of it that was more accessible. Which, is one of the primary arguments that his publishers, I'm sure, brought up, was that, you should make this more accessible. We know that you like the design of it, but, the reason that the knockoffs came out was that it was a very cheap version of the story that was popular, so it was easily accessible, which is, you could parallel with the modern idea of like streaming versus buying like the hard copy, so.
And the story itself, it is a charming story. He was right in that he had hit upon something much bigger, and part of the reason that we now for sure know that to be true is that it has survived all this time, and it's still a charming, interesting story. And it just told the way that it is. It has stood the test of time. It's something that is still charming and interesting.
He decided early on that he wanted it to put 2 things at the center of the story, and not just the story, but Christmas itself, which was nostalgia, which had been lost, because at this time, Christmas had sort of fallen out, which it waxed and waned throughout the years, but at this time it had died out and people weren't really celebrating as hard. And so he decided that he wanted to put nostalgia at the center of it, the idea of the past, and focusing on where you came from, who you were, people that you've known for years, putting that at the center, and also charity, the idea of being kind to people, to doing things like the altruistic nature that he has in a lot of his books. Not necessarily pity, but empathy for people who may have it worse than you.
Which there was not necessarily a lot of in England, in London at the time. There was, as a lot of his books describe, a lot of people living on the streets, people living in orphanages, people who are just hungry. I know when I was in high school, my English teacher described that England in that day of if you wanted a servant in your house, like if you were a person of means, you kind of needed a servant for things to run because you don't have the dishwashers, you don't have the, either you're going to spend all your time cleaning or somebody else is. But he said the way he phrased it is you could just go out into the street, pick somebody up, dust them off, and bring them in your house, and there you had somebody who would work for you because they, terribly poor and were delighted for the job, even if it were, just having a warm place to sleep and food in your belly was a big deal. I mean, there were two very different Englands depending on...
Right, and it was something Charles Dickens observed right before he started writing. He had done 2 tours of factories where children had been working, and there were several publications that came out at the time. They were starting to not turn a blind eye these horrible working conditions for a lot of these people. And after touring the scene, he decided that this is just not right. We have to rethink this. And the first decision to write something came at that time. He wanted to write something like an essay to society, like, look, we have to stop thinking about everything, like our society, our working classes, how we're treating each other, especially during the holidays. He wanted to write something, and he decided last minute, it's not going to work. Like, all this is going to do is make things worse. I have to find a different way to get this message across. I have to find something that people will pay attention to and can actually influence society in a way that, because most people don't want to be told you're doing this wrong. What they'd rather do is read something that gets them thinking that maybe I'm doing something wrong.
So Scrooge in that case is society.
In a lot of ways, there's a couple of figures in that time that he based it off of. The idea of even just him having all these layers of clothes and just shuffling through the streets and not paying attention to anybody else in the first stave of the story is just symbolic of that. The upper class wasn't paying attention to. Mm-hmm. So the whole story becomes essentially a vehicle for that entire message, and obviously it sells out and it's received, and even to this day we're still putting nostalgia is still a big part of Christmas. The worst parts, if you notice, the parts that people complain about Christmas are the parts that don't fall in line with that original nostalgia. They say it's too commercial, it's about buying things, but the parts that we all like are the parts where it's like, well, you're surrounded by family, and oh, we used to do this when we were younger, maybe we should take the kids out and do that again sometime.
And we cook this specific thing every year, and we and we get, this is when we give to charity, and this is when we think of others, and it's better to give than to receive, and all of that stuff. Interesting. Even this notion of the Christmas tree, right? Mm-hmm. I'm trying to remember from the book how much they talk about the Christmas tree, but certainly in everything you see, that plays a big part in it. Yeah,
the Christmas tree was in a way brought on like the baton in a track meet. It was Prince Albert and Queen Victoria who brought back the way it had fallen out of style to use a Christmas tree, and they started to do it. And like much like everything else during the Victorian era, once those two started doing it, everyone started to do it again. Right. So the Christmas tree had started making its way back into the house. What Dickens did was take that baton and say, okay, I'm going to put the Christmas tree not just at the center of everything that I'm doing, but it's going to become a symbol for something. It's going to be not just a decoration for the house, but it's in the living room. It's where people are coming around to hang out by. It's where people are coming to with their family. It's very warm, it's glowy, and it's immediately contrasted with the cold darkness that's right through the window. And if you're standing outside of a house and you look in and see the tree, you always see the people around it. So it became this weird emotional symbol for warmth and coming together.
It's interesting because in a lot of you talking about that, and a lot of, as we have been talking about this, the person who keeps coming to mind hasn't likely been born yet, or maybe he was, but he's affecting things much later, and that's Norman Rockwell. Mm-hmm. That Norman Rockwell sort of does this same thing again in a way, or at least creates a visual of it. Mm-hmm. Not only for Christmas but other holidays, and kind of takes that family and really looks at society too. It's interesting because not a lot of people, a lot of people think Norman Rockwell only talked about the pretty, but he does the same thing. He looks at the difference between the classes. He looks at the difference between races, but does it in a charming and friendly and disarming kind of way.
Yeah, it makes things like Christmas the biggest, longest running collaboration project through generations. It doesn't inherently have any value. I mean, there's no rule book that says Christmas has to be nostalgic. It has to be this, it has to be that. It's up to interpretation. And so what should always happen is every now and then someone should come along to reframe it. And so that's what Dickens essentially did.
I will tell you this. So even though when you were saying that some of the things that we think of are bad, like the over-commercialization of Christmas and it doesn't fit into Dickens, there would be people who would complain about Dickens' view too. And namely, that would be the church. Various churches would say that Dickens' version of Christmas, while it does talk about being good to your neighbors and being good to other people and giving and all of that, that it is still very secular. My argument for that and probably Dickens is, as human beings, we may not know where it comes from, but we all know what's right and wrong. Like, we just know it inherently.
Right.
And this is just what's right.
Right.
And whether you think it's just what's right because it's your religious belief thinks is what's right, or if it's just humanity about what is right.
And the brilliance of his writing comes out in, earlier you were mentioning how it's sort of up to debate whether or not it happened or it didn't happen, whether or not the ghosts were real or not.
Right.
He makes several, he was on his dying days especially, he very much urged the New Testament and was a very religious man. And he was throughout his life, but like most religious men, it also went through ups and downs.
Yeah, because a lot of the religious, religious people, not that I'm not one, but if you're looking at the church, would say, oh, but it's all supposed to be about Jesus's birthday, and not. I'm trying to remember if Jesus and his birthday was even mentioned. It probably was.
Well, it was mentioned, but it's like the ghost thing where he walked the line so thinly. One of the first descriptions of Jacob Marley when he shows up is that he was without bowels, which is a direct reference to the Bible, where it talks about having compassion for other people. So it's a direct reference to the Bible, basically saying he took the form of a ghost who didn't have bowels because he didn't show compassion for other men. So there's enough religious reference where if you are a religious person, you can see this as a truly New Testament story. But if you're not, there's enough there where it also exists in a universe where that's not the most important part of it.
I also think that historians pretty much would tell you that Jesus was not born in December. It was April, and I think April, but the reason that we celebrate Christmas in December has more to do with the pagans in Rome being conquered and Constantine saying, okay,
Mm-hmm.
We'll be Catholic, but I'm going to tell you right now, we need a big holiday, and it needs to be in December. And
that right there is why before Christmas Carol, Christmas started dying, because what happened was communities realized, why are we celebrating this again? Didn't we just do this is this even really a holiday? And so that's why traditions like the Christmas tree died. This is why the Christmas feast died. It's why it was sort of just there. They weren't paying enough attention to it. And then along comes Dickens, who says, this is an important holiday if you just put charity at the center of it and if you put these societal issues that we're having year round in focus during this time, suddenly this isn't just a quote-unquote knockoff holiday. This is a genuine holiday that we not only want, but we need. It was like he was trying to cure societal problems, like
right.
A medicine.
So are you saying, did Dickens really care about Christmas at all, really? Or was it more about how are we going to get people to be good again?
The answer is both. Based on what I've read, the answer is both. When he turned 12, something happened to his family that many have argued basically changed him for the rest of his life. And it wasn't something that suddenly created genius, but he was already a genius. He was already going to become a genius, but it modeled what form his genius would take. When he was 12, his family, because of his father's spending and his just mismanagement with money, they went from fairly well off in the middle class to suddenly absolutely broke. And at 12 years old, it was completely traumatizing. He went from being able to go to school to having to work at a shoe polish factory just sticking labels onto cans and stuff like that. And these were like the worst years of his life because this man who he had once loved had done something that had just suddenly ruined everything.
And what was that? Do you know?
It was a combination of mismanaging money, spending too much, and I think some investments he made that were horrible, but it was just blatant mismanagement of money and hiding it long enough to where there was nothing they could do last minute to fix it. So that was his first experience being in a workhouse and actually seeing firsthand what child labor is like because he was a child laborer. And a lot of what Scrooge is that conflict of whether he loves his dad or whether he hates his dad, because you have at the beginning in the first stave, Scrooge describes who his father sort of became, this dark person who he didn't really like. It was this dark entity but at the end of it is more the Scrooge, the father that he once loved, the one who he just was fond of, that was happy-go-lucky. So a lot of historians have said that the two contrasts of the before and after Ghost Scrooge is an embodiment of how he felt about his father. So yeah, he works there for years and years, and he starts writing, and eventually he works to a place where he struggles for a lot of his life. His wife he meets his wife and he eventually has 6 kids, and his fifth or sixth kid is about when he writes Christmas Carol to sort of support them. The character Bob Cratchit, who Scrooge works for, is in a lot of ways inspired by who he was at the time when he wrote this. Cratchit also has several kids. He also has a wife who supports him, is a very joyful person, is a very nice person, and he's sort of underneath this dark evil entity, Scrooge, who again could be seen as sort of a father figure that he didn't really get along with, because Scrooge isn't the nicest person to Bob Cratchit in that story in the beginning by any means.
Right. What about and Bob Cratchit feels this loyalty to Scrooge and this love for Scrooge that isn't entirely
justified.
Right.
It's not. They don't. Yeah. So again, it's that father-son. It's not quite father-son, but it is father-son in a lot of ways. I have read that Dickens was struggling at that time when he wrote Christmas Carol, because the Christmas Carol wasn't just for society, it was also for him. He did have conflicting views about Christmas. A lot of the bad things that happened to him happened around that time.
So Tiny Tim then represents the weak and the needy, I'm thinking. So children, orphans, even, maybe elderly people who need help and assistance, the poor, the homeless.
Even the term Tiny Tim's even used now in writing to denote a character or a body of characters who is a victim that has no cause in why they're a victim. Just an innocent. Tiny Tim isn't responsible for anything that happens in the plot. He's just the one receiving a lot of the dark parts of the universe, being sick, being part of a family that can't afford to necessarily feed him. He's just a helpless victim.
Who later tiptoes through the tulips, something that you will not understand. You can look that up.
Tiptoes through the tulips?
Yes.
Was that like a euphemism for dying, or it gets close to it?
No, sometime in the 60s, it's before my time too, but there's a singer who's just awful. Sorry if you like Tiny Tim, but he was Tiny Tim and he played a ukulele, and his most famous song was Tiptoe Through the Tulips. So
I see.
I no relation, I think.
What's interesting, there's been articles, and I think there was even an episode of House where they jokingly tried to diagnose what the character Tiny Tim might have had.
Whatever it was, money could solve it quickly.
Right, and that's
from death to happily ever after.
And that's one of the diagnosing facts they use, and I think they determined that it's probably, if anything, some form of rickets or some other disease where it's a lack of calcium, it's something where if you had more money, you would eat more frequently, and the food that they had at the time had a lot of.
So it's not like a staph infection, it's some sort of.
They think it's a nutritional deficiency. It's something that has to do with that, and there's only a handful of diagnoses, that have that.
Yeah.
So I think they were thinking. I think they assumed it might have been rickets, if it was anything.
I could see Dickens going, "Okay, guys, it's a story. I made it up." Like really.
Right. Well, which that happens
Maybe.
a lot when you read things and you try to attribute. But he, along with other writers like Edgar Allan Poe, would also frequently publish essays or publish quotes or be interviewed, and they would talk about what their intentions were. So he was pretty transparent what his entire purpose was with this story. He said, I was going to write this essay about how bad the work environment is, but I decided that making a fictional story might be a more efficient way to convince people, go with their hearts as opposed to their minds. So in a lot of these things, he was pretty transparent about.
But absolutely, that's the right answer. We would not today be reading and watching plays on why you should treat people better.
No, and there's something to that. You can watch, even today, like when there's a subject where it's too risque to talk about at dinner, well, people are fine watching a movie about it. Or reading a book about it, or listening to music about it. There's something about art that allows you to just come in, think about it without any sort of immediate, you have to think about it this way, you're wrong. You get to come in, just here's a story, take what you will.
That's pretty much everything science fiction ever was. So, I'm a Trekkie and I like the science fiction stuff, and a lot of that is you see science fiction come to life more and more when we are at war, when there is an other, and a lot of what science fiction is about is we're all humans. The minute you jump into a science fiction type of world, if you are human, you are one of us, and then there is an alien. And you even learn to love, a lot of times, that alien, or love and understand. So, man, if you can befriend an alien, why on earth are you having trouble with another human?
Star Trek was responsible for a lot of that, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and there's, that's a whole podcast as to whether it was genius, whether it was intentional, because Roddenberry himself said some contradictory things, and
but it got people talking about it, or at least thinking about it in a different way.
But it happens again, like when it comes to any of the wars, like even Desert Storm. I'm trying to remember what it was called, but back in the day when in the 90s when Desert Storm first started, there was also a new show about aliens that had come to the U.S. and they were in New York and they were trying to assimilate them, and I watched it, but I can't really remember the name of it, but it always seems to happen with war.
Right.
And the message is, really, this other is a terrible person? Are you sure? Like, do you really understand them? Like, they're human. So it is sort of Dickensian in that way, I guess.
I like that word, Dickensian.
Even something, as seemingly innocuous and just sort of a romp, just a sitcom can teach you to love a character that you wouldn't otherwise meet or understand.
Yeah, and of course, if you take it to extremes and you really look at it, you can see how powerful it is when you think about the idea of vigilantes and how people can watch TV shows and movies where the main character is a vigilante who is breaking the law, but they're willing to suspend that immediate, he's breaking the law, and go, well, why is he doing this? What led to this? Is there something in his life that changed? They're giving it more leverage to come inside their mind and change maybe how they think about things. Whereas if you read in the news about a vigilante, you immediately shut down. You say this is an evil person, which they are, but they do something and you just shut yourself off emotionally. Mm-hmm. Stories allow you to say, no, it's okay to think about this. You're not doing any crime by diving a little bit deeper into who this person is, and that's the entire point of empathy, is getting to that point.
Where we are now with Christmas is we have this feeling of sort of nostalgia about it. There are a lot of movies that people watch year after year about it. This is continued, where there are a lot of kind of nostalgia movies. But Christmas lately, has become very commercial. To the point that it's become so commercial. It used to be that when I was little, that no store would even think about having any kind of Christmas decoration out until after Thanksgiving. It would just be tacky. And then it was before Thanksgiving, and now it's before, Halloween, and there are places that do Christmas all year round. And I think what I'm finding is that people are almost, okay, first of all, nostalgia and everybody coming together and family creates a lot of pressure for people, because they maybe don't get along with their family, and they have this feeling that it needs to be a perfect Christmas, and that perfection is different for everyone at the table. And it's, there's many stories, and people have experiences of the holiday not being as perfect as we had hoped, and in some cases a really fabulous disaster, and all the pressure, and maybe if you're alone, maybe if you're not dating, if you don't have a family, it's also sort of the time when you get together and you're kind of judged, like mm-hmm. Are you showing up with with a boyfriend or a girlfriend? Are you married by now? Are you, it's this sort of comparison of all this. So it on the downside, it did kind of create this yardstick that we all felt we needed to measure up to. And then there's just this huge, ridiculous consumer. It's not even just commercialism, it's consumerism. This overemphasis on stuff that we're all frankly drowning in. And in this day and age, even if you're what we would classify as poor, you may have too much stuff. So we're probably ripe for some sort of reset, to the point where a lot of people, again, have just thrown up their hands and saying, I'm not doing this anymore. I can't live up to these expectations. I'm over all of this. We kind of went from, okay, we're not giving gifts to each other, we're just going to give gifts to the children, to, okay, we're just going to give gifts to the children, and by the way, we don't need to all get together. I can feel that distancing happening again.
Yeah, and I think what you're feeling is the same thing that everyone's feeling and have been feeling. It's the topic of, especially with social media, there's hashtags dedicated to how horrible of a time people are having while they're hanging out with their families during Christmas. It's like everything else with society. It's a forest growing too big, and it gets too big, and lightning strikes, and it burns down, and then it needs to expand. It's just a constant cycle. So the first death of Christmas happened mid-19th century. People sense that Christmas isn't useful, it's painful, it's not, there's no real purpose for it. And now we're starting to get that again, where it's like, well, Dickens comes along, it explodes and becomes this magical thing, and then consumerism takes over, and families get more complex, and we're able to see everybody, so we're able to see too many people, and there's social media, and we're just completely taken over by all these senses that a lot of us don't want. It's maybe time to forest fire and think about what parts of this do we want to keep and what parts we want to get rid of.
I think that's brilliant. I agree. I think that would be a great exercise, because
so what are the parts you like and what are the parts you don't like?
I don't know about for Christmas, or because a lot of that in the US anyway happens at Thanksgiving. Is when we start thinking about a lot of that, where we're giving thanks for what we have and thinking about giving to others who don't have as much. But the problem with it is it seems to all happen at one time of the year. And so you have everybody and their brother who's done nothing all year, who want to serve food to the poor on Thanksgiving Day. They don't need anybody to serve food to the poor on Thanksgiving Day, because that's what everybody wants to do, because it's kind of like that nostalgia thing and you're checking off the box. I think we need to think more in terms of charity and giving back every day. It needs to be more of an everyday thing. For me, the family part of it and being with family, the older I get, the more I realize that, we all have different definitions of family, but there are people, it's this whole thing of you don't choose your family, you get what you get. And while you may love your family and you may not, there's this thing of your chosen family, like the people who truly every day of your life make a difference. Every day they're consistent, they're there, the ones that you can call on, the ones that would encourage you and cheerlead for whatever you're doing no matter what. And for me, those people haven't been celebrated as much in any kind of way. And for me and my life, on a daily basis, those people make a bigger difference in my life than some of my family. Not all, but than quite a bit of my family.
So instead of putting by default family at the center, you might make it more about just connection of any kind.
Yeah, and celebrating that you have this group of wonderful people who may or may not be related to you. Mm-hmm. I just don't think that them being blood relation is necessary. And in a way, that also takes pressure off, where maybe you did have this father that you don't get along with like Dickens did. And to be able to heal that and say, well, I don't have this father, but I have this amazing friend. And isn't that every bit as important? This is the person who has supported me and who I in turn support. So I think that there's something to that. And I'm not talking about your, 1,382 Facebook friends. I'm talking about the one who really has your back every day.
Yeah.
And if you don't have that, I'll go all Maya Angelou on you. And that is, her advice was, really, you don't have a good friend? Are you a good friend? Because before you can have a good friend, you need to be a good friend. We hope you enjoyed this Yuletide episode of Maurer Glass Podcast. Merry Christmas to you and Happy New Year. We look forward to seeing you next time.